The steps to purchasing a property are often seen as fairly simple and often skipped over by the media, by other property investors, by other kind of property content out there, even by agents. And then there's an assumption that actually everyone understands and knows each of the steps in detail. But I know, having spoken to a lot of our clients and other property investors, that actually the opposite is true, and that not many people really understand what each of the steps involves to purchasing a property. So today I'm going to be running you through step by step how to purchase a property, what each of the steps involves, including the finance side of things, the legal side of things, and the due diligence that you're going to do on that property. I will be basing this off a mortgage purchase because that is what the majority of people will be purchasing. And I think one key thing to say is that purchasing a property does take quite a long time, particularly starting from scratch in terms of like doing the viewing, doing the analysis, and then going through to the legal process. All of that could take 4 to 5 months, because the finding the property, doing the analysis, due diligence, that could take potentially 2 to 3 months. And then you've got the purchase, which on a mortgage at this point in time is actually taking 3 to 4 months. I think there's an expectation that it will be a lot quicker than that, but the reality is that solicitors and lenders don't move that quickly, and the pace of transactions that slowed down around COVID time has kind of continued. And I think that 3 to 4 months for purchasing a property through a mortgage is quite normal now. So the first step is your finance and access to mortgages. You need to understand what capital you have available, and you need to go and speak to a specialist broker. So whether you're buying a residential, you need to go and speak to a specialist residential broker, or if you're buying a investment, you need to go and speak to a specialist buy-to-let broker in order to understand your access to mortgages and to understand what interest rate you'll get, what loan to value you can get, what purchase price you can get, a minimum and the maximum, as well as any other restrictions that you may have on your mortgage. You need to understand this first, because this will set the parameters of your search and put certain restrictions in place. For example, you might not be able to purchase a property, below 75,000, for example, or above a certain amount depending on your salary. And the reason that you need to do this first as well is because the mortgage that you can access is dependent on you, your circumstances, your job, whether you own any property, whether you live in your own residential property. All of those factors are considered when lenders make mortgage decisions. So it is very much tailored to you, and this is why it's the first key step for you to go and understand that information and speak to an expert about what mortgages you're able to access. And also, speaking to a broker gives you a range of options rather than going speaking to a bank where they'll just have their products. Speaking to a broker will mean that you get access to a lot more lenders and a lot more options, which should ultimately reduce your interest rate and give you more choice. So next stage in the process is selecting the property, which I've covered a lot elsewhere about how to do due diligence on a property. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to sort of skip the step of selecting the property. So I'm going to go straight to viewing. So at the viewing, this is where you're doing due diligence on the property itself and the area. At that property, you need to ensure that you're using a checklist for consistency and to ensure that nothing is being missed. And particularly if you're viewing a number of properties, it means that you're viewing them all consistently and following the same process to ensure that you're able to compare like for like. Another thing I would advise on viewings is that you take your time. The agent will often want to rush you, and some agents still only allow 15-minute viewings, but try and speak to them nicely to try and get a longer viewing, and take your time, concentrate and follow your checklist in order to get the best results and ensure you're not missing anything. Ensure that you are spending time on the externals as well, on the landscaping, the garden, the roofs, the gutters, because all of these things can really burn you if they are missed, particularly the kind of roof. So make sure you're spending as much time on the external due diligence and review as you are on the internals. Make sure you're using a damp meter as well to check every single wall on the downstairs of the property to see if there is any damp. And from all of that analysis, you should then come out with an idea about what the list of works that needs doing to that property to get it up to the standard that you want, to the standard of the comparables. And then you need to put a cost estimate towards that, and that could be something that you look to get support on from builder, for example. Either have them walk around with you or speak to them after to see rough costs for each of the elements that need doing. So the next step is the offer stage. So once once you have carried out your analysis on what is the property worth when you've carried out the list of works that you have estimated at the refurb, which is the done up value or the end value, you should have also calculated what the rent will be, what your costs will be on a monthly basis, how much money you need to put into the deal, including the refurb, including the deposit, including all of associated fees. And then from that, you should be able to work out what your returns are going to be. And then you should be able to analyze whether the deal has some good margin in it, whether it's making the return that you want it to make. And it will give you an idea about where you might offer in terms of the purchase price. So you should have an offer range that you are happy with. So from this set of returns and margins, you should be able to understand whether this property meets your criteria based on a presumed purchase price. But you should have a set range of purchase prices. So for example, if the property is on for 80,000 on the market, but to meet your criteria, you'll only be able to offer between 70 and 75. 75 is your max. So that gives you a range for your offer. So as with all offers, you will start at the bottom, you start lowest, and in fact, you may go lower than your first step in order just to be a little bit cheeky and to see what you can get away with. So actually making the offer, now that you've got your ranges, it's best to have that conversation verbally with the agent, and you could have also spoken to the agent at the viewing, for example, to do a little bit of fact finding. Have they had any interest on it? Have they had any other offers? You know, what kind of ballpark figure is the vendor looking for? It's likely that the agent might be a bit coy here, and that's normal. So that's why having a follow-up phone call about the offer is important, and approaching it in a way where you're essentially putting in an offer without putting in an offer. So it's more of a conversation. So you are essentially saying, I've estimated X amount of works on the property and I'm buying this as an investment. So I've got my margins to look after, and therefore I could only offer £70,000 on this property. Is that something that would be acceptable to the vendor? So you're not actually putting in the offer, you're asking the question, would that be acceptable? And it's a good way of having an informal conversation about the offer price and getting a gauge about what might be accepted. And this will give you a starting point for that negotiation. And then if they say, no, they wouldn't accept that, they're looking for more like 75 or 77, whatever their answer is, you can actually put in a proper offer then, say, okay, well, I will put in an offer at 73,000. Can you put that to the vendor and see what their thoughts are on it? Then you should follow up that phone call, put that in writing, in an email, because it's likely that they will just forward that email on to the vendor. And here it is going to be a negotiation. There is going to be some back and forth, and go up in small increments, and don't just pick round numbers, pick slightly odd numbers, because that makes them feel that you've got a specific kind of number in mind, and you might have only a specific kind of amount of capital. And there's something about psychological kind of pricing in here. So for example, it might be that you put in an offer in this case of 73,597, and then just leave it for 24 hours, 48 hours, and let the agent have those conversations. And don't be too desperate to kind of ring back, because you know, desperation never sells, never gets you where you want to be. And then if the offer gets rejected, go up in smaller increments, maybe of like 25%, and kind of go from there. And you've got your maximum range, so don't go beyond that. And then if you can't get the offer accepted, then just walk away. But if the offer is accepted, then we're on to the next stage. So the next stage is, once your offer is accepted, the agent will require certain documentation from you. So they will require your ID, they'll require a proof of address, and all of this is to do with their anti-money laundering. They will need to have an understanding of where the money's come from that you're purchasing, whether you're purchasing on cash or mortgage. They will need your solicitor's details, and you will also need to provide proof of funds, so for the deposit as well as for the mortgage. So for the mortgage, you will need to go back to your broker and ask for a document which is called a mortgage in principle, which means that they have got a principal offer, I suppose a draft proposed offer from the mortgage lender that they, based on certain criteria, will lend you the money. And once you've got that from your broker, which could take 24 to 48 hours, then you can send that across to the agent as proof of funds. And the memorandum of sale will be sent out to both parties and their solicitors. And this is the kind of the initial legal paperwork to show that the offer's been accepted. It shows details of both the buyer and the vendor and their solicitors, and if there's any conditions of sale, and is the sort of key document to kick off the legal process. So the next stage is around your mortgage. mortgage, and this is the mortgage application stage. And this is the stage when you have to provide and complete a lot of paperwork for your broker and for the lender. And this is all about applying for that mortgage and for the mortgage company to make an assessment on you via all of that paperwork. So you will have to provide pay slips, bank statements, proof of address, whether you own any other property, what your employment status is. You have to provide a credit report, and obviously if you've got any issues with credit, that needs to be flagged up then. So they're essentially assessing you and the viability of you for that mortgage before they start to look at the property. And then the application will be submitted to the lender via your broker, and once they're happy with it and that's all been assessed, then the lender will then instruct a valuation of the property, and that's when they're starting to look at the viability of the property and starting to do their due diligence on it. So the next stage is the valuation and mortgage offer stage. So this is where the valuation will happen, and a surveyor will normally go out to the property themselves. They won't go with anyone else, and they will assess its condition and whether there's any key works that they want to undertake before they would lend. So some lenders, for example, will insist that if there's damp work, that the damp work is carried out before the purchase goes through or within 3 months of the purchase completing. And all of that is to do with the lender managing their risk, because they don't want to essentially take on a property that has issues. So they want to ensure that those issues are sorted before they actually lend on it. Surveyor will also carry out a desktop analysis of the numbers of the property, and that is to ensure that the lender is not buying a dud. So they're not buying a property that's actually worth less than you're paying for it, and then they're not going to get into problems later on down the line and essentially get into negative equity and have to have repossessions and things like that. So they will do that desktop exercise. They will carry out analysis of comparables and sold prices in the area to come up with a market value for that property, and they will base their recommended purchase price based on those comparables and the condition of the property and the state it's in at the moment. I would say here that surveyors and lenders, particularly in this kind of mortgage environment at the moment, are often quite cautious, and they may come up with reasons and kind of blockers as to things that they want sorted before they lend on it. And in some cases, I would say that there's some lenders out there that are really cautious and in fact will just put up blockers because they don't really fancy doing the deal anymore. They might change their mind or they've changed their criteria. So if that happens, just go back to your broker and to find a solution and potentially just find another lender. So if the valuation report comes back all okay, then the mortgage offer will be processed, and then you will receive that, and so will your solicitor. And that's a kind of key milestone for everyone involved, and it gives reassurance to the agent and to the vendor that you have the required lending in place, and that it's likely that the transaction from a lending point of view will go ahead. And that offer will only last for 3 months, so you have essentially a 3-month window from that mortgage offer being received to complete that purchase. Guys, if you're enjoying this video today, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to our channel. It all means a lot and it would really help us to grow. Thanks very much. Another step in the due diligence process is the survey. Now, this is known as a building survey or a home buyer survey, and this can be separate to the valuation report from the bank. Some banks will do a home buyer survey and combine it into one, but you normally have to pay them an additional fee to do that. But it's important that you do get this survey done, because you need to ensure that the structural integrity of that property has been evaluated by a professional to ensure that you're not buying a property with subsidence, and any key defects have been pointed out and evaluated. You're going to have a much better idea about the property that you're buying and how much that's going to cost you, and firstly in terms of the refurb, but also in terms of ongoing maintenance. What I would say is about the survey is that surveyors are very cautious by their nature. Their job in that survey is to point out every single defect within that property, however small, and the language that they will use can sound quite dramatic and scary. So every kind of crack, even if it's a small crack in some plaster or a chip in a paving slab, will be written up as if the property is falling down. So it is important that you read that report carefully, but also take some of the recommendations with a slight pinch of salt and follow the kind of key recommendations. They will be recommended on a sort of traffic light system, a green, red and amber being the sort of top priorities, the most urgent priorities, and then the sort of green ones being the sort of lowest priority that might not require any attention for a number of years. So it's important to prioritize the things that you get in your survey and evaluate it carefully, because you're not going to be able to, particularly if you're buying an old house, you're not going to be able to make it into a new build, and the surveyor will be, as I said, flagging up every single defect in that property, and you're not going to be able to repair them all. So it's important to kind of dig through that and ensure that you're just picking up the most crucial ones. It will also provide a set of recommendations for your solicitor to look into. So for example, in terms of the planning permission or building regulations, whether there's any structural changes that have been done to the property, and that should be sent to your solicitor to look at. And also it will be a set of recommendations for you to look at and discuss with your builder to get some professional advice on. So in parallel to the mortgage application process that I've just mentioned will be the legal process, and that's all managed via your solicitor. One of the key first steps of that is to onboard yourself with the solicitor, make sure they have your documents and you've completed all the necessary paperwork from them in order for them to onboard you as a client and to start the transaction. Then they will receive all of the legal pack about the property from the vendor's solicitor, and then they will start to kind of work on that and evaluate it. And it is here at the kind of beginning stages that they will ask you about searches, and they will ask you to normally pay for those searches in advance, because those searches can take up to 8 weeks in some councils. So searches are a set of reports and pieces of analysis that give you information of which you can make a decision and which your lender and your solicitor can advise on. So one of these being environmental, so that's whether the property is in a floodplain, where is the property built, what type of land is it built on, has there been any previous uses of that property. You know, for example, there's some properties that are built on land that used to be rubbish dumps, for example, or used to be quarries, and that land is typically more at risk from subsidence, for example. You've also got coal mining reports, particularly in those areas where there's been previous uses of the land for coal mining, so in Wales and in the northeast. Also within that local authority search, it will flag up whether there's been any works done on the property previously, so whether there's been any planning requests, whether there's been any conversions that have required building regulations, and all of those will be listed. So then the solicitor can compare that to what's actually happened on that property. And also within this search will show up the boundaries of the property and whether they match to the actual records that are being shown on land registry. Another search is a water and drainage, and that's all to do with, are you connected to a main sewer? Are you connected to a mains water supply? Because obviously there's places in the countryside that might not necessarily have that if they're more remote. So all these searches are to do with due diligence about the property and ensuring you're not buying something that is going to cause you problems and cost you a lot of money in the future. This may seem complicated and a lot of information, but this is the role of your solicitor to take all of that information and distill it down for you into layman's terms so you can understand it and help make an informed decision. So once the mortgage offer is received, the next stage is called enquiries. So these are essentially a set of questions and requirements from both parties. So the lender will have a set of requirements that they want answered from your solicitor, and your solicitor will have a set of requirements that they need answering from the vendor solicitor as well. So it is here that miscommunications can happen, and because you've got 3 parties involved, sometimes there is breakdowns in communication and one's not talking to the other. So it is important that you're on top of your solicitor to be liaising with both the lender and the vendor. They should all be talking to each other weekly and directly and working through the list of requirements that each need to answer. The lender will raise a set of requirements, as I mentioned, and for example, this would be if you're buying a buy-to-let property, they will ask for things like the gas safety certificate, the electrical safety certificate, the EPC. If it's got a tenant in situ, they will ask for a copy of the AST. The lender will also ask for the searches, so they want to read and evaluate the searches as well, and they would want to look at all the documents on the property, including the lease if it's got one, if you're buying a flat. It is here as well that the lender could raise further questions about yourself as the applicant purchasing the property. There might be things that still need answering or bits of paperwork that are out of date, for example. If the transaction's taken quite a lot of time, they may want up-to-date pay slips showing your wage that month rather than your wage 6 months ago. In unison, your broker, your solicitor and yourself will work through that list and satisfy those requirements from the lender, and your solicitor will also advise on the questions that they're asking the vendor and working through all those to make sure your solicitor is happy from a legal standpoint to whether they are happy for you to purchase the property and whether they feel that everything is okay from a legal standpoint. And once some good progress is made and you're nearing the end of the transaction. The contracts will be sent out to yourself and the vendor to sign, and this is where both parties need to sign these documents to ensure that one, you're happy to buy the property, and two, they're happy to sell the property. So there's two bits of paperwork involved here. There is the actual contract, which is that you're purchasing the property, and there is also a land registry document which gets held on land registry called a TR1, and that is signed by the vendor and yourself. And all of that paperwork just essentially states the key details of the property and the purchase price and your details. You also need to sign all of the mortgage documents and contracts, and lenders normally require you for investment properties to actually get independent legal advice, which is normally abbreviated to ILA. So the lender normally requires you to see a separate solicitor to talk through the mortgage documents and the offer, so you should understand the lending and the loan that you are getting and understand your responsibilities and the impacts if you don't keep up with your payments. This is something that's more of a requirement now since the 2008 crash. And you also need to get all of that paperwork witnessed, including the mortgage documents. You need to get that witnessed by a separate person as well, and all of that needs to be signed in paper because the property industry is still, and land registry is still way in the dark ages, and everything is still done on paper. And the next stage is exchange, and that means we're nearing the end of this property transaction. We could be in kind of month 3 or month 4 of the actual legal process, depending on how quickly everyone's moved. And this is where the final checks are being done. Your solicitor will send you a kind of overall report for you to read and to flag up if there's any concerns that they have. All the inquiries should have been, and the questions and the requirements should have been met and answered now. This is where the contracts are exchanged and the sale becomes pretty much legally binding. It will cost you a lot of money if you wanted to pull out at this point. And this is also where a small deposit is normally sent across to the vendor of 5 to 10% as part of the exchange process to show that you're serious and to commit to the purchase. And then you can breathe a sigh of relief once the exchange is done, because as I mentioned, it's very difficult for the deal to collapse at this point. Now it's just about agreeing a completion date. So the completion date will depend on a variety of things, but it mostly depends on when the lender is able to provide their funds. So they normally require a minimum of 5 working days notice to provide their funds. So this will be the number one factor and lead time as to when you can complete. In the interim, while you're waiting for completion to happen, you should receive a completion statement from your solicitor, and that's essentially a financial statement which outlines all of the costs of the transaction, including the purchase price, including the lender's loan, including any money that you've put towards the searches so far, all of the legal costs, the stamp duty and the searches costs, and then you'll have a balance to pay at the end, and that is the amount that you need to transfer to your solicitor before the completion date in order for the transaction to complete. And all the funds go through your solicitor. You don't see any of those funds from the lender. Everything goes through your solicitor, and they will transfer your funds and the lender's funds on the day of completion to the vendor. And then once they are received, both solicitors will confirm the completion and they are in receipt of the funds. And then the completion of the property has happened and the property is officially yours, and you can pick up the keys, and your solicitor will then wrap up everything in terms of registering that property legally and sending all the information to land registry about the purchase price and the fact that the property is yours, and they will do that after completion has happened. So you've made it to the end of a property purchase, and yes, as you can see, there is a lot of steps and it can be a little bit complicated. But what I would say is the reason you're paying for a broker, you're paying for a solicitor, a surveyor, is because these are all experts that you should be leaning on throughout the process. And what I would say is don't be afraid to ask questions, even if you feel the question is stupid, because you are paying them for a service at the end of the day, and they are there to guide you through it and give you advice where needed, and to ensure that you're comfortable with the purchase, and to ensure that you understand any risks regarding that property and how, severe or not those risks are. So do lean on those as property experts, because that's what they're there for. And what I would also say is stay organized. Get all your paperwork all in one place, whether that's digitally or in paper, and be on it, everyone, regularly, sort of daily or bi-daily communication with all the key parties involved to ensure that they are moving at the speed that you want them to. So that is a step-by-step of a property transaction. It's long. long, it can be a little bit stressful, but ultimately it will be worth it, and it will give you the foothold and the step onto property investing that allows you to meet your goals. Thanks for watching another video. Really appreciate it. Can you do me a favor? Can you subscribe to our channel? There's so much more great content coming up into the future, so it means that you don't miss anything, and it helps us to know that there's people out there valuing our content by getting all those subscriptions. So thanks very much.